Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Jaya Giri Varadhari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Jaya Giri Varadhari Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Nati Ravanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Thank you. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 5, which is entitled Vidura's Talks with Maitreya, verse number 27. Tato bhavan mahat tattvam avyaktat kalachoditat Vijñānyātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam stato nudha Tato bhavan mahat tattvam Avyaktat kalachoditat Vijñānātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam stato nudha Tato bhavan mahat tattvam Avyaktat kalachoditat Vijñānātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam stato nutaha. Vishvam vyanjam stato nutaha. Tato bhavan mahat tattvam Avyaktat kalachoditat Vijñānātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam nutaha. Tato bhavan mahat tattvam Tatkalachoditat Vijñānātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam stato nutaha. Mataji's. Tato bhavan mahat tattvam Avyaktat kalachoditat Vijñānātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam stato nutaha. Anyone else? Tato bhavan mahat tattvam Avyaktat kalachoditat Vijñānātmā dehastam Vishvam vyanjam stato nutaha. Okay. Word for word. Tata, thereafter. Abhavat, came into existence. Mahat, supreme. Tattvam, sum total. Avyaktat, from the unmanifested. Kala choditat, by the interaction of time. Vijnana Atma, unalloyed goodness. Atma dhamstehastam, Atma dehastam, situated on the bodily self. Vishvam, complete universes. Vyanjan, manifesting. Tamanudha, the supreme light. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki. Thereafter, influenced by the interactions of eternal time, the supreme sum total of matter, called the Mahat Tattva, became manifested, and this Mahat Tattva, the unalloyed goodness, the Supreme Lord, sowed the seeds of universal manifestation out of his own body. If you'd like to repeat after me. Thereafter, influenced by the interactions of eternal time, the supreme sum total of matter, called the Mahat Tattva, became manifested. And in this Mahat Tattva, the unalloyed goodness, the Supreme Lord, sowed the seeds of universal manifestation out of his own body. Purport. In due course of time, the impregnated material energy was manifested first as the total material ingredients. Everything takes its own time to fructify, and therefore the word Kala Choditat, influenced by time, is used herein. The Mahat Tattva is the total consciousness because a portion of it is represented in everyone as the intellect. The Mahat Tattva is directly connected with the supreme consciousness of the Supreme Being, but still it appears as matter. The Mahat Tattva, or shadow of pure consciousness, is the germinating place of all creation. It is pure goodness with the slight addition of the material mode of passion, and therefore activity is generated from this point. Mangalacharya. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamascha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadhavetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamascha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namustate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhyubhe Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nityanamine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Shri Ki Jai. So before I get into the verse, I'd like to summarize, kind of understand where we've got to in the Bhagavatam so far. So in this chapter, which is entitled Vidura's Talks with Maitreya, we see that Vidura starts to approach Maitreya Muni to understand the real happiness in terms of devotional service, because he realizes that material happiness is not giving him any pleasures. And so he inquires about the process of devotional service, creation, and all these different things, all these different aspects of the Lord. And Maitreya Muni then starts to glorify Vidura for his inquiry, because he says that actually Vidura is showcasing true taste of Krishna Katha. And we understand that Krishna Katha is the summum bonum of any spiritual practice. This idea of glorifying the Lord, the idea of discussing the Lord's pastimes. And that's what we as devotees live for. We're not interested in politics. We're not interested in the drama series on TV. We're not interested in any of these things, because what is enlivening for the soul is Krishna Katha, is discussions about the Lord and his devotees. And so Maitreya Muni starts to narrate about the Lord's pastimes. He starts talking about the material manifestation through the Lord's external energy, Maya. And in verse 26, I'll just read the translation out. We came to the supreme living being in his feature as the transcendental Purusha incarnation, who is the Lord's plenary expansion, impregnates the material nature of three modes. And thus, by the influence of eternal time, the living entities appear. So before I start talking about today's verse, I want to seek the blessings of all the assembled Vaishnavas, the senior devotees, and my friends, because I'm not a scholar, I'm not a learned person, and this idea of creation and how the Lord creates is very much beyond my realization. And yet I'm sitting here, and hopefully I can share something which is the realization of Prabhupada's purports from the senior devotees that I've heard and spoken to. And hopefully in time, I can also have my own realizations that I can share. Because we see that time is actually a transformative agent. We can hope things for the future because we understand the element of time makes change. It's an agent of change. We see there's a pastime with Srila Prabhupada where he was sitting in a park, I think in America, and he was just speaking to a person on the bench. And what was the discussion? He was saying that I have all these temples all around the world, but he says, only time separates me from them. So even Prabhupada recognizes that time is just a change agent. If we look at the material world, if we look at our bodies, the material nature, we understand that the progression of time helps it transform from one thing to another. It's described that there's 6 transformations of the body. Birth, then it grows, then it stays for some time, then it gives off byproducts, then it depletes, and then ultimately gives way, it dies. And we see this transformation happens with anything material. Think about the phones, the way it gets manufactured and then end of life. Buildings, anything material goes through these 6 transformations by the progression of time. If you look at chemistry, rates of reaction, chemical reactions, you have some chemical reactions that take a very, very long time. Just think of iron or any metal. Add oxygen, add some moisture, and over time, months, maybe even years, rust. But then on the flip side, you've got something like petroleum or natural gas. Apply a bit of combustion, and immediately it flames up. Immediately the chemical reaction takes place. So we see time is just a very big element for anything to move in the world. And in this verse and in the purport, in the Sanskrit, it says Kala Choditat, which Srila Prabhupada talks about in the purport, saying influenced by time. He says everything takes its own time to fructify, and therefore the word Kala Choditat, influenced by time, is used herein. Even when we go to the scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, one of the 5 principal topics of the Bhagavad Gita is Kala, which is time. So we see time is actually just like a catalyst which invokes transformation, it invokes change and manifests different varieties in the world. And in the same way, time in this section of the Bhagavatam is described as a catalyst for the material nature to manifest in the form that it is today. Because it talks about how the Mahat Tattva, the sum total of matter, became manifested by the influence of time. So that's the importance of time. But then what is this Mahat Tattva? So the Mahat Tattva is described as the sum total of matter. It's the origin of creation. It's basically the source of all the building blocks of the world. How do we understand this? Well, think of any software program. Prabhu's got a laptop in front of him. Think of any software program. Think of Photoshop or Canva or any sort of program that you have. It's got its own building blocks. It's got its own things that exist, that are features of that product, of that software. And then what do we do as the user? We use the building blocks to then create a nice fancy poster, nice fancy design, a nice Word document or something. And then we say we've created this poster. Think about a kitchen. Kitchen is the source of the building blocks for cooking things, right? You've got, what do you have in a kitchen? You've got utensils. You've got maybe a fridge, a cooker, an oven. But then you also have ingredients like the fruits, the vegetables, the spices, the herbs, and all these raw materials. And then as a chef, as somebody who's in the kitchen, we'll go in, we'll use all these building blocks that are in the kitchen to then make nice, tasty prasadam. So like this, we can see like programs are like a small Mahat Tattva, a small manifestation of these building blocks. It's got its own little ecosystem. Kitchen, its own little ecosystem. And in the same way, this material manifestation is just a bigger ecosystem for the building blocks that we see around us, for the manifestations we see around us. And we say that we created these designs, we created this meal in the kitchen. But did we actually create it? All we did was use these building blocks available to us to then arrange and manifest something that looks appealing or tastes nice. So actually we didn't create them, but we say we created. And in the same way, when we look at a misconception with Lord Brahma, people often assume that Lord Brahma created the universe. But actually, I think it's Canto 2, there's a discussion between Narada Muni and Brahma, where Narada Muni is glorifying Brahma to say, wow, you created all this, like tell me, how did you create this universe? And Brahma's like, hang on a second, no, let me correct you first. I didn't create anything. The Lord inspired me to use the building blocks that He's given me to then manifest the world in its current shape and form. So we often assume, or people often misassume that Brahma is the creator, but actually he's better described as an engineer. Because an engineer takes what is available and then creates something out of it. They arrange it in such a way that a manifestation is possible. Even when you look at the 10 topics of the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's 2 topics, Sarga and Visarga, I believe. Yeah. Sarga is what? Primary creation, which we attest to being Vishnu or Krishna. But then we talk about Visarga, which is a secondary creation, which is taking the building blocks from the primary creation and then arranging it in such a way that manifests what is appealing, what can be utilized through a secondary creation. And we attest that to Lord Brahma. So Brahma is not really the creator of the universe. We see Krishna or Vishnu are the creators, or the creator, and Brahma is the engineer. But then we might think and question, okay, well, where did these building blocks come from? The Mahat Tattva, we talk about the Mahat Tattva. This section of the Bhagavatam talking about the creation, talks about Mahat Tattva in so many different ways, but where did it come from? So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada describes how the Mahat Tattva, or shadow of pure consciousness, is the germinating place of all creation. Srila Prabhupada describes that actually this Mahat Tattva is just a shadow of the spiritual world. It's just an imitation of the concepts from the spiritual world. How do we understand this? Well, just think of any toy house, think of any toy train. You've got an actual house where people live in, but then when a child wants to play, Papa, Mommy, I want a house. You don't go buy the child a big house. You go buy them a toy house or a toy train. And what do they do with that? They pretend and play around in that house or with the train as if it's the real thing. As if they're a controller of that house, of that train. And in the same way, the Lord manifests this world for us so that we can experience what it's like to be the controller, the enjoyer, the proprietor of this toy world. Because we understand many times Prabhupada references that this material manifestation is just 1/4 of the entire universe, of the entire creation. Spiritual world is 3/4. Just like a house and a toy house. House is a big thing, it's a big deal, it's the real deal. Maybe 1/10 of the size is a toy house. And if you're rich, then you might have like 1/4 of the house is a toy house. So the material manifestation is actually just a toy imitation of the real deal, of the spiritual manifestation. And the spiritual world is described as Chintamani. It's described as spiritual and conscious. It's actually described as conscious matter. Whereas the material world is unconscious matter. This microphone, this stand, doesn't have its own consciousness. It doesn't have its own desires, its own feelings. It doesn't do things on its own. But in the spiritual world, you desire something, and all the energies in the spiritual world, all the manifestation in the spiritual world, helps to bring that desire to life. Because it's conscious. So then we might ask, well, how does the spiritual matter become material matter? Because if everything stems from, if we describe the Mahat Tattva as the shadow of the spiritual world, then how does it manifest into unconscious matter? So then we can go through Sankhya Yoga, or Sankhya philosophy, which is somewhat described in this chapter, but then it's also described by Kapila Muni, or Kapiladev, in, I think it's later on in this canto, chapter 26, 29, something like that, where he talks about how manifestation actually comes into being, right? How the Mahat Tattva manifests. So it all starts off with Purusha, with the Supreme Lord, and his external energy. And at some point, the Lord impregnates Prakriti, the material energy, such that it becomes Pradhan. It becomes an unmanifest stage. Pradhan is basically non-different to Prakriti in the sense that it's just an unmanifest version of it. Think of your kitchen, where you're buying a house and you're just seeing a kitchen and you're thinking, okay, this could be a really nice kitchen, it can have all these different pieces here, but nothing's there, nothing's manifest. It's an unmanifested state. But then what happens? Maybe you buy the house, you start populating the kitchen with ingredients, with utensils, etc. And in the same way, that pradhan, over the course of time, starts to become manifest as Mahat Tattva, as all the ingredients that then go inside that kitchen. You've now got all the utensils because you've bought them all. And Mahat Tattva in some places is also described as cosmic intelligence. It's basically the Supreme Lord's intelligence, the buddhi. And over time, again, what happens is that Mahat Tattva then becomes manifest as ahankar, which we understand as false ego, or individual intelligence. So you've got the supreme intelligence, and then you've got individual intelligence. And this individual intelligence has three types of energies: goodness, passion, and ignorance. And then from these variations manifests the different components that we have in the world, like the senses, the mind, the intelligence, all the gross and subtle elements. Why am I describing these things? Actually, forget me. Why is the Bhagavatam describing all these things when we as devotees understand the Bhagavatam is meant to be a text of love for Krishna, developing our love for God? Because we understand that even in this world, if we want to love somebody, we have to know about that somebody. We have to know about all the different facets, all their different sides, all the different angles by which they live, their personality, their characteristics, what they do. Imagine a boy and girl, they say that they love each other, but they have no idea about each other's life. I say I love you, but I don't know anything about your job. I don't know anything about your personality. I don't know anything about your family. I don't know any of your likes or dislikes. I don't know what your abilities are. Shri Shri Radha Gokulananda Sitaram Lakshan Hanuman Gaur Nitai Ki. So then can we actually say that we love that person? Because we can only love somebody if we know about them. Because love is also an expression. If we don't know what that person likes, if we don't know anything about the person, how can we express love in a way that they'll receive love, in a way that they'll receive or feel wanted? We can't. So in the same way, Bhagavatam, yes, it's a text that describes and helps us develop our love for Krishna, but it's a text that helps us know Krishna so that we can love him better. And even in the Bhagavad Gita, we see that there's two ways that we can understand the Lord through his external energy, his material manifestation. Especially in chapter 7, Krishna goes through this. One is as seeing Krishna within the creation. Rasahama Psukonteya, he's the taste in water. Whenever we drink water, we can see that Krishna is present here. His energy is present here. But the other is seeing him as a source of creation. Because when we see that Krishna has a unique ability to manifest so much everything around us, we can appreciate Krishna. In the Bhagavad Gita, in 10:8, chapter 10, verse 8, he says, Aham sarvasya prabhavo matta sarvam pravartate iti matva bhajante mam buddha bhava samanvitaha. He says, quote, I'm the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who perfectly know this engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts, unquote. The idea is that if we see Krishna as a source of creation, when we properly understand him as a source of creation, then we also have the opportunity to come to devotional service to Krishna. In one of the purports of the Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada talks about how, I think it's chapter 7, he talks about how there's some people who think that Sankhya Yoga, this idea of understanding metaphysics, the understanding of how this world exists from the Lord, is different to bhakti. But actually, Prabhupada describes that the ultimate goal is the same, because once you understand how the world functions, naturally your appreciation for the Creator also manifests. And therefore you come to this stage of, let me serve the Supreme Creator. But bhakti becomes the direct path for us to just go, let's develop our loving relationship for Krishna. And so when we understand Krishna as a source of creation, then we can appreciate his supreme potency, his different attributes. And that helps us deepen our love for him as well. And when we look at this idea of causality, this idea of creation and who created the creation, who, if we just look at buildings or just material world around us, who created this building? Who created that? Who created him? Who created this? Who created that? When you go back to the source, this idea of causality, cause and effect, then we see that modern science has different theories for the creation of the world. Big Bang theory, steady state theory, so many things. But when you go deeper in this idea of causality, you see that so many questions come out of them. What is the Big Bang theory? It's this idea of the whole universe was in a singular point, in a very dense, compact point. But then a question of, well, why did that point exist? What agitated that point? Steady state theory is about the universe always existed. Time was always manifest, and the universe always existed. It's just expanding. The same amount of matter is there, but it's just expanding over time. Well, what agitated the universe to then expand? Because nothing moves without there being an energy and influence for it to happen. So what agitated the universe to expand? Then there's an interesting new one. Simulation hypothesis. For those who play or have played computer games, it's basically like this world is a computer game for a higher being. It's a true theory. You can research it. It's this idea that we're basically part of somebody else's bigger plan. Somebody's created this world for their toy. But then, okay, who is the person who's playing with the toy? Who are the people? Who is the advanced civilization? And why did they create this toy? So many questions can come up just from the modern scientific theories of creation. Now, some devotees will say they're incorrect. Some devotees will chastise them heavily. But I'll say that actually, they're partially correct. Because there is truth in them. I just described Mahat Tattva, this idea that everything manifested from unmanifest. Isn't that a bit like the Big Bang theory? But we go a step further and explain actually, why does that point exist? Why did the unmanifest become manifest? Steady state theory, this idea of expansion. Mahat Tattva, what do we do with ingredients? We use ingredients to build other things. We're expanding the universe. The same ingredients are there, but we're expanding our understanding of the world. Because the world is also expanding. Steady state theory is there in our philosophy. Simulation theory, 100% is there. Why? Because, sure, everybody's heard it. We came down to the material world because we wanted to enjoy life without Krishna. So at some point, we wanted to manifest this world to experience the computer game so that we don't have to worry about the real life, the real world that we're living in. So again, even simulation theory is somewhat manifest in our philosophy. But we see that all these modern theories are incomplete because they don't have an understanding of who is the supreme cause, or what is the supreme cause. And Lord Brahma gives that to us in his Brahma Samhita. Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchidananda Vigraha Anadir Adir Govinda Sarvakarana Karanam. Brahma says that Ishvara Parama Krishna, the Supreme Lord, is who? Shri Krishna. Satchidananda Vigraha. He's talking about the type of body, the type of physique, if we can call it that, Krishna has. Form of Sat Chitananda, eternality, bliss and knowledge. Anadir Adir Govinda Sarva Karana Karanam. He's saying that Krishna has no other origin. He's the origin of all. He's the original source of everything. And he's the prime cause of all causes. When you think of causality, how did this happen? How did that happen? How did that happen? Brahma is describing that Krishna is the ultimate cause of all causes. And that's where modern theories fall short, because they don't understand and they don't go tracing back to the supreme cause. And so when we study creation in the Srimad Bhagavatam, we can also follow the same principle. We can try and understand, when we're going through these very analytical, very philosophical and rich sections of the Bhagavatam. Okay, there's one side is that we can follow the Sankhya approach and try to understand it through analysis. Try and understand it through analogies. Try and understand it in relatable ways. We can do that if we have the intelligence for it. But we can also just take the principle, which is understand that the cause of all causes is ultimately Krishna. Because that's ultimately what Sankhya philosophy is taking us to. Because when we trace it back, then we see that the Mahat Tattva is taking us to the Mahat Padam. I think it's Padam. Yeah, Mahat Padam, which is the shelter for the material creation, the shelter for the building blocks. And that shelter is described in Canto 10. So Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 10, chapter 14, verse 58. Says, Samsnita ye pada pallava plavam mahat padam punya yaso murare bhuvam buddhe vatsa padam param padam 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 yat vipadam natesham. It's described that the shelter of the total cosmic creation is the boat of the lotus feet of the Lord. Translation is, quote, for those who have accepted the boat of the lotus feet of the Lord, who is the shelter of the cosmic manifestation and is famous as Murari, the enemy of the Mura demon. The ocean of the material world is like the water contained in a calf's hoofprint. Their goal is Para Padam, Vaikunta, the place where there are no material miseries, not the place where there is danger at every step. Unquote. So the shelter of material creation is the boat of the lotus feet of the Lord. And that's ultimately the supreme cause. So whether we come through the Sankhya philosophy, whether we come through the direct bhakti philosophy, what do we want to do? Take shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord. So to wrap up, I guess, because I think we finished at past on weekdays. this idea of creation, this section of creation can go over people's heads. It goes over my head. And that's okay, because there's the detail of creation, to understand Krishna as a supreme Lord, as a supreme cause. But then we understand that there's also the direct path of understanding that he's a supreme cause by directly engaging in devotional service. Because once you go through the intellectual route of Sankhya philosophy, you come ultimately to the point of, let me serve the supreme creator, Krishna. So then that, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Questions, comments, corrections, elaborations? Yes.
Just one small thing. Those 6 processes, but I always thought that that's for the non-living, not only for the living thing. But
Non-living.
that's for all material things. I was wondering, let's say you gave the example of building. How producing offsprings is a characteristic of building or for any other material thing. So can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so these 6 transformations are for any non-living thing, right? Not living, because we understand that the soul never dies. So how can it take birth? How can it die? When we look at buildings, for example, then we understand that there were ingredients first, they were part of earth first. But then as they were born, then they grow. So somebody's bringing them together, they're transforming into a specific ingredient, whether it's concrete, cement or whatever it is. Then, so you've got growth, then it stays for some time, right? So once a building is made, it stays for some time. Offspring, well, once it starts to crumble, then things manifest from that as well, right? Either from the direct ingredients, or it can become a storehouse for other things to manifest from. And then naturally it dwindles because no building lives forever. 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, whatever. And then ultimately, once it's no longer useful, what do? Take that same earth, discard it, and then maybe utilize it for something else later on. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you for the class, Prabhu. Mahatattva, in the text itself, it says Mahatattva is unalloyed goodness. And then later on in the purport, Prabhupada is continuing with that theme. It is pure goodness, but then he says with a slight addition of material mode of passion. So how do we understand this? If it's unalloyed, if it's pure goodness, but then he's saying, no,
Thank you.
A tinge of passion there.
Yes. So, in the purport, in the last line, Srila Prabhupada says, it is pure goodness with a slight addition of the material mode of passion, and therefore activity is generated from this point. To bring an analogy of bhakti, the practice of devotional service is always pure. But we bring our own contaminations to it. We bring our own influence of the material modes of nature to the process of bhakti. Bhakti, the chanting is always pure, but because of us bringing our contaminated mind into the japa, what ends up happening? We're not getting the full benefit of the japa. I don't know if it still goes around, but I remember there was this picture that was going around on WhatsApp of like a water pipe, and then things are leaking from it, and that's basically an analogy for our process of chanting, where the first leak is us like speaking to people, second leak is us thinking about things, and so on and so forth. So even though there's a stream of water going through the pipe, what ends up coming out of the pipe are droplets of the benefit we're getting, because the water is basically our bhakti. So that's an analogy with the bhakti aspect. How do we apply it to the creation? We understand that Mahatattva, as I described, comes from the spiritual world. It is a shadow of the spiritual world. So it's all pure in itself. But in order for activity, in order for the manifestation to take place, in order for something to move in this world, it needs to be influenced by time. And in order for it to be influenced by anything, passion is necessary, because passion is the mover. When you look at ignorance, it's inert, it's inertia with no benefit. It's just pure inertia. When you look at goodness, it looks like inertia, but it's supremely beneficial because it's the right type of inertia. But in order for something to move, in order for something to happen, you need the passion. So that's why we also say that Brahma is head of mode of passion, because he's the creator. Creation means moving things. It means that you have to agitate, it means you have to change or transform. I hope that helps. Thank you. Now it's level 2.
Again, in the purport, Mahatattva is the total consciousness, because a portion of it is represented in everyone's intellect. So because there's Mahatattva within us or in our intellect, therefore Mahatattva is total consciousness. Just trying to understand that.
So went from level 1 to level 5. It's interesting because when I was reading this verse, when I was preparing for this verse, I was going through the Sankhya Yoga chapter as well. And maybe some of the devotees in the room who are more intellectually inclined can help, because when I read the Sankhya Yoga philosophy aspects, I'm reading it the other way around. That it's from the Mahatattva that the individual intellect manifests. Because actually, even in the previous verse, we see that it follows the suit of the train of thought that Prabhupada is talking about, because he first impregnates the material energy to bring out living beings, right? So he talks about, and that's by the influence of eternal time, the living entities appear. And then he's talking about the Mahatattva being manifest. So I don't know, but I don't know if somebody else who is more intellectually inclined can help. I apologize. Do you want to take? Yeah, so pradhan is the unmanifest. And then from pradhan comes the manifest, which is mahatattva. And then from mahatattva comes ahankar, which is the individual consciousness. But as Paramakaruna Prabhu was rightly saying here, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada's almost describing it like it's the other way around. The Mahatattva has an existence because a portion of it is represented in everyone as the intellect.
I'm understanding the way you said the question also. It's manifesting by the glance.
Do you want to put the mic up?
It's manifesting because of the glance of Mahavishnu on the pradhan. That agitates it to turn into the Mahatattva, and everything's coming from there. So at least that's how I read it as well.
Thank you, Prabhu. Sorry. Any questions, comments?
Thank you. Just to say what comes to mind for me in terms of the intellect, that the intellect is the final decision-making factor in terms of the mind and so on. So that the consciousness comes from the soul, but in terms of everyone's total consciousness is ultimately decided by the intellect. In terms of the decisions, that's what comes to mind in terms of the elements of the material nature.
No, thank you. It's a nice way to see it as well. I think Brojan Prabhu.
I'm going to the Bhagavad Gita, which is the basis of whatever I seem to understand about Krishna. It's in the chapter 11, the universal form. He says, O Lord of the universe, I see your body with many arms, many pails, expanded everywhere, without limit. I see no end, no middle, no beginning. Your form is difficult to see because of this glaring effulgence. Yet I see this glowing form of yours everywhere, adorned with beautiful crowns and clubs and discs. You are the supreme primal objective. You are the resting place of this universe. You are inexhaustible. You are the oldest. You are the maintainer of eternal religion, the personality of Godhead. This is my opinion. So, in this way, we can see the questioning has a purpose, and the purpose and the goal is bhakti. Yeah. So, that's what I take from the universal form.
Yes. Ultimately, the philosophies culminate in bhakti. So practicing the direct path. So yes, thank you, Prabhupada Prabhu. Krishna. Any final questions, comments? Okay. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki. Shubhapad ki.